Great. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. I'm Polly Mackenzie. I'm the Chief Executive of Demos, which is a cross-party think tank working to involve the public in the process of policymaking and policy design. One of the things we're doing this year is running the Work Shift Commission to explore the way the transformation of our working lives over the last year has the opportunity to actually change more about our relationships with work to the benefit of individuals, communities, and society as a whole. And Julia Hobsbawm, who joins us today, is the chair of that Work Shift Commission. But one of the areas that Julia wanted to explore is the impact that transforming relationships with work could have on one of the most vital kind of social issues of our age, which is improving diversity and inclusion in our society and opportunities for people of all backgrounds and all kinds of lived experience to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to thrive. So that's why we are delighted to be partnering with the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities to explore the way this work shift, this workplace change can actually liberate opportunity for people from all across our different communities and different societies. So the first person who's going to speak is Kunle Olulode, who was a co-opted member of that Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, the director of a fantastic organisation, Voice for Change England, a charity and infrastructure support body. And he's going to take us through the agenda. We'll then have Julia to speak, to talk through how work shift is addressing these issues of diversity. And then we'll be joined by Shaquille Butt, who is a senior leader in the humanitarian sector, and Trevor Phillips, who is, I'm sure needs almost no introduction, a writer, broadcaster, and businessman, chairman of Green Park Group, and a Ned at Mind Gym, which is one of my favorite organizations. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Kunle to talk us through this agenda. There will be questions after all of our speakers have spoken. So if you have thoughts, immediately just put them into the Q&A below at the bottom of your screen, and we will be delighted. I'll put those questions to the panel at the end. Kunle.
Thank you, Polly, for that introduction, and good afternoon to everybody in London. I'm currently in Barcelona, stranded by COVID restrictions, but I'm really pleased to be part of this important discussion in the time that we've got available. I'll be fairly precise and concise with my introductory remarks, but just to say that the CRED report, when it was initially kind of pitched to me to be involved as a commissioner, my general feeling was that the time span of 6 months to actually come up with a report on race, such a controversial and all-encompassing subject, was pretty ambitious, to say the least. And indeed, I felt that another commission that I'm on, the Windrush Work Group, which is running for 3 years by comparison, on a single subject, it should have been given perhaps more time to breathe as well. But nevertheless, the death of George Floyd precipitated a need that was felt by central government to respond to some of the discussion that was being launched in relation to both similarities between policing in the United States and the UK and differences, and also a need to, I suppose, establish where we are in terms of the arc of racial equality in relation to a number of features of discussions that had emanated from the United States, primarily from publications, many of which I'm sure people are familiar with and will be touched upon by speakers today. But my background and my charity's role is really in stimulating a debate that we think is long overdue, and importantly, looking at the question of race from a different perspective than perhaps people were used to. And certainly the question of employment and enterprise, I think, were, for me, two key areas that the report and the researchers were looking at, that I felt were really essential that we were involved in that discourse. Polly's already alluded to the response to the report, which in some ways has been predictable and to a certain extent disappointing. Predictable in the sense that the opposition to the report seems to have been constructed along political lines and was very much there prior to the report actually even producing itself to the public. And then certainly, I think, disappointing in the sense that the ability to be able to have an objective and innovative debate on a subject like race, I think it's still proving to be quite difficult. But nevertheless, I think that the report has done what it set out to do, which is to provoke a debate. And there are many people who've contacted me, cut through the kind of noise of the controversy, have said to me, I actually don't care what people think about this report. I'm really pleased that we're having this discussion. We've needed to have it for quite a long time. And certainly, I think from an academic standpoint, the very idea that racial disparities may be shaped not only by race, but by other factors, such as geography, unintended consequences, is something that we still, I think, are struggling to get our heads around. But I hope that in terms of looking at the data, the commissioners quite faithfully followed where the evidence took them. It was not something where we had predetermined views about the outcome and just looked for the evidence to suit those outcomes. We took a view that society in itself was at a juncture of changes and shifts, and that some of these assumptions underpinning racial disparities certainly required interrogation and scrutiny to see whether they stood up. And I think that in relation to employment specifically, it's one of the trickier areas, without a doubt. The report highlights the fact, for example, that in relation to education, we have seen fourfold improvements for specific sections of ethnic minorities that have improved outcomes at academic level. However, the translation of that academic success into the employment market has not always been consistent. And I think that studies from a range of sources have highlighted that. The question of whether persistent disparities in unemployment rates is consistent across age groups is something also that the report considered. And I think one of the revelations was the fact that the closing of, certainly in terms of pay and wages, the closing of the gap of young minorities with their white peers is self-evident. And the statistic of the gap closing from 8% to around 2.3% over the last 10 years is something that needs to be considered as quite an important development. But whereas if we look at the question of unemployment rates as an absolute across BAME groups, if you like, we still see a pattern of disparity, which can, in certain cases, be explained as racism. And in other situations, we see the elimination of racist differences. So if we're looking at the tech sector, and I'm sure that Trevor will come on to this later on, we see different patterns in terms of the employment of Black and minority ethnic individuals. We also, if we look at gender, we see different patterns in terms of where disparities exist and where they're in the process of being eliminated. So the picture that we have in terms of looking at discrimination is a mixed one. And it's here that I think that people have struggled to accept that actually not everything that's happening in the employment marketplace can be painted negatively. And at the same time, we should also be wary of painting too glossy a picture when we look at overarching data and break it down, obviously, into more nuanced ethnic data. But I feel that the report itself has made an incomplete but valid attempt to actually look at the questions of racial discrimination and its social impacts in the employment market in a very different way than is conventionally held. And I think in time, certainly the methodology and the depth of new research that hopefully will follow on from the credit report will bear out that the commissioners and the individuals involved in looking at these areas were on the right track. As I say, there are aspects of the report certainly that I think are open to criticism in terms of method. But I think in general, if you're trying to do something innovative in such an emotive area, then it's sometimes it takes time before people can actually see the wisdom in the approach that you've taken. We now have 24 recommendations of the report. I think there are some exciting areas in there that certainly require further discussion, and I would like to think that people will engage with those recommendations and begin to flesh them out, including, of course, central government, who hopefully will be in a position to run with the bulk of them. But who knows? We're awaiting the government's response. But I feel that there are aspects of the race field which are quite exciting in terms of the approach that's been taken both by academics and researchers over here. But I would just make one plea again, and that is that our culture develops along the lines of rigor and objectivity, and that we follow where the research takes us, no matter how painful or how challenging that might be to our own individual assumptions about what race is in British society today and what it constitutes. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that really helpful and such an important set of reminders around the complexity of this issue between different groups, different communities, a combination of factors, whether it's different industries, whether it's active discrimination or wider questions around poverty and social mobility. So, and absolutely, we strongly agree with you that following the evidence is an essential component of good policy making here. I'm going to invite Julia now to speak. Julia is a massive expert basically in human beings. Apologies, my cat has decided to join the meeting. Sorry about that. Maybe you're an expert in cats too, Julia. But so Julia's chairing the Work Shift Commission because she believes, as we do, that actually the disruption we've been through offers us an opportunity to perhaps improve the situation on a number of these measures. And without further ado, I shall hand over to Julia so I can get rid of the cat.
I love that cat. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this vital discussion. It couldn't be more timely, could it? Thank you to Polly for inviting me to chair the Work Shift Commission. I welcome this discussion in two contexts. One is because of my role with Demos and looking at the future of work and the role of inequalities in work and fairness at work, including that around diversity. The second is that I hope I've made a small contribution myself in my own working life with my network editorial intelligence. I set up and run something called the Social Capital Network, which rapidly renamed from being a BAME network to one around ethnic minorities, but in which we have consistently pioneered and piloted projects of inclusivity and social mobility. So I hope I have a small toehold directly in this discussion. Of course, this moment in which this discussion is taking place is not only framed against the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd and the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the eruption, quite rightly, into the politics of workplace, of inequality and race in particular, but post-pandemic life and work and how that will affect the workforce. And what I was particularly struck by is that the recommendation of fairness at work is 8th out of the 24 recommendations. It comes a third of the way through. It comes early on in the totality of the recommendations of the Sewell Report with good reason, because we're all supposed to work a third of our lives at most, 8 out of 24 days, but actually the blurring of boundaries and the working from home means, if anything, that edges upwards. And half the world's population works. And one way or another, even though statistically the absolute majority of people work still in farms and factories in the world, the reality is that the office, the nowhere office, as we've called it, and I call it, is the glue that binds everybody who works, the function, the cohesion, the teams, the belonging, the buildings, the operational side. And just to be clear, what unites everybody who works of any creed or ethnicity or background is an inequality in that all the data shows pre-pandemic that work hasn't been working. 85% of people in the Gallup poll don't like work. Epidemic stress levels across the working world, 17 million working days in the UK lost to stress, 60% of working days across the EU lost to stress, $300 billion cost the American economy alone, and so on and so forth. Work hasn't been working. And so what I bring to this discussion, I hope, is an enthusiasm that this moment is one in which we can reframe and reset and reimagine work in an equal way. Not from a position of the inequalities, but the equalities. So I'm just going to give 3 thoughts around how that might be possible to continue the conversation forward. The first is what I would call side by side. It's the whole question of social capital. It's the whole question that was raised in the report and which I'm deeply interested in, which is if you aren't giving people from school age the confidence to be imagining what the world of work is. My generation, I'm 56 going on 57, I watched Play School, where we'd go through the round window in a television program into a world of work every day. You want kids at school to have connections with workplaces, to go into workplaces and imagine themselves there. Side by side and mentoring, apprenticeship, call it what you will, is absolutely central, I believe, to creating a culture of confidence. The second is what I would call the center of the room, which is when you've recruited, when you are in work, when those workplaces are happening. Of course, the specific structural conversations around redressing imbalances and inequalities and racisms must and will and should be addressed. But it's surely going to move to being a conversation about what do we do in this workplace together. So I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with a client. The client, like I, is Jewish. There's a lot about racism towards Jews at the moment. This client and I have very different politics to the question of Jewish identity in relation to the politics of Israel. We talked about racism because there's undeniably been a mushrooming of racism against Jewish people. And you know what? We then got on with the meeting. Not because we were ducking a complex question, but because we weren't there to discuss our ethnic diversity. We were there to discuss the work and the project. Now, that is something that we have to have decisions about. Are we going to use the workplace fundamentally to work out the differences or the united points? And the final point is structure itself. The inequalities of the pandemic are clearly going to hit the demographics that have less flexibility, less autonomy, more dependencies, possibly less education than others. And so, for instance, Demos and the Workshift Commission is keenly interested in talking about reframing everything from collective bargaining to the tax system around who pays for your lights at home, who pays for your time to commute if you're in a job that is not deemed fully flexible, and so on and so forth. And so that is how I'd like to end my brief contribution, which is to say I'm an optimist, I'm a pragmatist, I draw inspiration from some great leaders of colour. I learned at the knee of Maya Angelou, the late great Maya Angelou, who possibly coined one of the great work from home poems without even realizing it, Phenomenal Woman, where she said that she walks like she has oil wells pumping in my living room. Well, that's the moment that we're in. We're all pumping our oil wells from home, from offices, and what matters is what it means to us and how we go forward together. Thank you. You're on mute, Polly.
Thank you, Julia. Double thank you. If anyone does have an oil well pumping in their living room, I would advise them to decarbonize and switch to a wind turbine. But other than that, thank you for those thoughts. I'm now going to invite Trevor Phillips to speak. Trevor has so much experience on the questions of race and diversity, but also in terms of HR and getting the best out of people with roles, as I've mentioned at Mind Gym, Green Park, John Lewis, the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And he's also on the board of my favorite think tank that I don't run, the Social Market Foundation. So thank you for crossing the threshold and being with us today, Trevor.
Thank you very much, Polly. It always worries me when somebody says Trevor has so much experience, because I know what the people who are listening think. Oh, he's so old. I'm speaking today really from the point of view more than anything else as a business owner. Our group has about 100 people working. That's entirely apart from Mind Gym, which has another 200-300 people working. But we specialise at Green Park in recruitment. In my company, Trevor Phillips, we work in analytics, and that I think will be reflected, I hope, in what I say. I should also just start by saying that, as Kunle, I think, made the point, forgive me that I came late to the discussion, but I think Kunle made the point that all discussion about race feels uncomfortable, and there's a reason for that. Across every other line of human difference, it's possible to imagine yourself really in a real world in the other person's shoes. We all get old. We've been, if we're lucky, we could change our sexual preferences, we could gender. I will, however, never not be Black. Now, for me personally, that makes me very happy every morning. I know for other people it's not so straightforward, but the point is that for all of us, when we're talking about race, we're talking about aspects of human experience that lie behind an opaque curtain, and that makes establishing what you might call a common language quite difficult, and that's why some of these discussions are quite hard. I heard that in this conversation could be ridiculously missing from the debate about Sewell, as I've seen it, as somebody will know. I've been off the radar for some weeks for family reasons, but I've watched it from the outside, and it is just mad. Let me start by quoting from the leader in The Economist last week, which I think reflects something, an attitude I think that I agree with. They say most racial disparities come about when three things collide: secular economic trends, the aftershocks of slavery and segregation, and present-day bigotry and racism. The first two are usually the biggest causes of bad outcomes for African Americans, but the third, racism today, gets most of the attention. This is backwards. COVID-19 has killed African Americans at higher rates than whites or Asian Americans. The causes are still unclear, but the blame is unlikely to lie with racist doctors, nurses, and insurers. Instead, for reasons that include past racism and present-day poverty, African Americans are more likely to suffer from pre-existing conditions and to have to work outside the safety of their homes, and less likely to have health insurance. You know, you wouldn't get that principle. The single biggest and most lethal disparity that identified in the report.
Well,
24 to 1. 24 to 1. Homicide rate differential.
We're losing you a bit, Trevor.
Black and white young people. This week, the shooting of
I think we're in danger of losing Trevor. Trevor, we're struggling to hear you. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, Trevor, if you can just...
The shooting of Sassy Johnson should have given the media every opportunity to highlight this fact. Nobody said it this week, and when we discuss, I can see you and all of you. Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think it might be best if we just pause.
Can you hear me now, Polly?
Yes, I can now. Oh, you're back. Now I can see you as well.
2.
I think it might be best if we just pause you for a moment, and maybe.
Carry on.
Yeah, and I'll turn to Shaquille.
You go.
And hopefully we'll come back to you.
Shaquille.
So thank you for that. I'm hoping my engagement will be slightly improved and not so interrupted. So I was going to say it's going to be a hard act to follow, Trevor. So I'm glad Trevor's going to go after me again now rather than Trevor going before me. So I suppose I'm going to come at this slightly differently and ask the question. And I think the point's been already been made. Did we need another report? The 1 year on, it was very clear what the catalyst for this report was. Did we need another report? Probably not. There's a value in it, absolutely, because it keeps the conversation going. And I think they made that point very early on, because the conversation is critical. And I think that question of whether or not Britain is institutionally racist, which is how this report was pretty much landed across many individuals. I think that question is a distraction, but I'm not going to shy away from that question because I think it's important that we do have that conversation about that question. I want to give some context to my viewpoint. I'm both a qualified accountant and a qualified HR professional. So as a qualified accountant, I absolutely, fundamentally believe that everything has to be data-driven, has to be evidence-based. So there's no doubt any issue, any problem, any opportunity has to come with that mindset of facts and figures. But I'm also a HR professional, and I sit on the CIPD board. And as a board member, I know our own professional body has done a lot of work on this area, and it's very clear there is a disparity. There's no doubt. There's a disparity in terms of the opportunities for people from Black and Asian ethnic minority backgrounds. I'm also a D&I consultant. I work with a number of organizations, and again, working with a number of organizations, I get to work with a number of large businesses, public sector organizations, private sector organizations. And the issue of racism is a real issue, whether it's being brought to the forefront more so as a result of the murder of George Floyd, but it's always been there. I do a number of investigations as an independent consultant as well, and the number of times I get embroiled in an ER investigation, employee relations investigation, disciplinary grievances, where race is a factor, compared to every other issue is quite telling. I'm also on the regional working group for Mosaic, which is an organization set up by the Prince's Trust. And we work with the most deprived, underperforming children in secondary schools. And when I go into schools across the West Midlands, it's always the children that I see, primarily who are Black and Asian. You mentioned at the very beginning, I worked in the relief and development sector, and as a consequence, I got to travel quite extensively. We worked in about 40 countries around the world. And what I found very, very early on is that racism isn't, unique to any one country. It's endemic across the world. Wherever you have minorities, you'll have disparity. So I do believe that, we do have a challenge, a real challenge. And I do think the work that was done as part of this commission is essential in terms of keeping that conversation going. And I think that work, picking up on Julia's point, can be a force for good, because it brings people who normally perhaps wouldn't come together. People who have different lived experiences, people who have different exposure to different, experiences in terms of their social network, the opportunities they've had. Coming together into the workplace can be a way to actually bring people together. And unfortunately, I think the pandemic has not helped in that regard, in that working remotely, the early research is showing that people's prejudices are probably more likely to come to the forefront rather than less, because we're not meeting as we normally would do, in more informal settings in the workplace. I'm going to, just to finish off in terms of some of the key points that I agree with, and just to give my take on those in terms of the report, in terms of the social impact, social class, the working class being a factor, absolutely. But I think it all comes back down to that legacy of how individuals initially came into the UK, whether that was through going all the way back to the slave trade, or whether it's going back to post World War, with the Commonwealth migrants coming into the UK to rebuild Britain. My father came into very low poor housing, low value housing in a very inner city part of city centre, Birmingham. It was very clear we were an impoverished area. The work that he was qualified to do as a mechanic wasn't, as an engineer for the British Army, wasn't on offer. He ended up on the production line. So the message that was drilled into us as children was very clear. You need to educate yourself to get out of these ghettos, out of these environments. And education was seen in the Asian community as a passport. So when I saw in the report that Asians, people from Asian backgrounds tend to do as well, if not better than their white counterparts, that might be because of the mindset that was drilled into us, that we had to do better in order to get onto that level footing. But again, as I said, having 2 professional qualifications hasn't made my career path any easier. I went from being a HRD to then ending up as a freelance consultant, because I found the marketplace wasn't open. So I don't think education in itself is a passport. I don't think my lived experience, and certainly the lived experience I come across, whether I'm wearing a hat, working with Mosaic, or working with as a D&I consultant, or carrying out investigations, or as I said, on the CIPD board, there is a real challenge that is cross society, and perhaps all societies. And I think we do need to have these honest conversations. And I deliver unconscious bias training, but I'm always caveat that at the very beginning by saying this is not going to fix anything. You can't undo the mindset that's been created with decades of conditioning, social conditioning, in the space of an hour or a day's training. It's not going to happen. And it does require a much more strategic approach, just like any issue, to understand what is your starting point, what you're trying to achieve, what are the milestones you're going to measure, and then report on it. So I'm going to shut up there, because I could talk about this for quite a while. I'm hoping that's given time for Trevor to reconnect with us and to say something amazing. So thank you.
Trevor, are you there?
I am, and I hope that I'm now back in the room.
Yes, I can hear you beautifully.
Okay, great.
Feel free to talk about inequality and access to good broadband connections.
Yeah, that will come down the road. Look, where I was pointing out that we should have had a conversation this week about this extraordinary number. It's the single most exceptional and new and interesting number in the entire report. The 24-to-1 homicide differential, white, black. Not a word in most of the media. And this week, when we should have had that discussion, when the media discovered that Sasha Johnson had not been shot by some white guy, the story has completely dropped completely out of anybody's consideration. Why? Because the public narrative about race at the moment is dominated by white guilt. Activists are obsessed by what white people think about black people. Language is more important than actions. Now, I grew up in a place where all that seems very, very odd. I grew up in the Caribbean. I was born here. And what white people think about us is frankly not that important. Whether we prosper and whether we feed our children and house our elders is what matters, rather than what some racist might write in a newspaper that none of us ever reads. So I think the context of discussion about Sewell really has to be reset a bit. Now, I have some reservations about the report. I mean, I think it was a great effort, and I don't want to go on, because actually I think anybody who's fair-minded will have seen how important this was in terms of trying to create a grown-up discussion. I think it has become vulnerable to the shouting match, because in an effort to anticipate the sort of usual criticisms, I think that the report spent a little bit too much attention on matters like language and activist preoccupations. What we didn't hear enough about were the disparities that emerged from the experience of migration. So, for example, Pakistani Muslims arrived in a period just before depression, compared to, sorry, I beg your pardon, African Caribbeans arrived in post-war period, rationing, economic slump, all of that, compared to East African Asians who arrived in a period of growth. We need to think about what that did to those different groups. I don't think there was enough experience in relation to economic change. Pakistani Muslims came here when we had a textile industry that was flourishing. It collapsed for reasons which had nothing to do with race, but actually it has left that community or those communities in a catastrophic situations. Somebody who is very famous, comes from Burnley, once said to me, if Burnley didn't have a football team, it wouldn't need to exist. Now, we're not really thinking about those issues. And the reason we need to think about them is looking forward. Conley mentioned the impact of AI and digital. The transport sector, a quarter of Pakistani Muslim men work in transport, and retail, massively disproportionately employing people from ethnic minorities, particularly women, are set to be completely devastated and transformed by digital. And by the way, we're talking here about millions of people in each case, millions and millions of people. Much, much more important than many of the other things that we hear. Not much wealth disparities in the United States. Disparities 10-to-1. We don't know what it is here because we don't bother to measure it. and so on and so forth. Now, you know, to be positive about what we might do, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be brief about this. What should we really be thinking about? You know, what should a government minister be saying in response? So I tried, if I could, to imagine a rational response from Boris Johnson or Liz Truss. And I know there'll be people listening here who will say that's an inconceivable possibility, but let's just imagine that there's a rational response. What would they say? They might say this. One of the insights of Dr. Sewell and his colleagues is that whilst many disparities are due to what we call racism, that is unequal treatment of people of colour by the white majority, many disparities have little to do with personal distaste or individual attitudes. What some people call structural racism can exist even in the most liberal of institutions. The BBC, I'm looking at you, because they are the consequence of economic, demographic, or historical forces. In short, while we can attribute many of the differences that cause disadvantage to race, not all of them are due to racism. This is important if we're interested in action that changes people's lives for the better and not just conducting a war of and about words. For example, 1 in 13 people of West African heritage have their lives constrained by the possession of sickle cell gene. I am one of them. Sickle cell can lead to severe disability and death. It can even limit the choice of a marriage partner. Same for Asian and Middle Eastern families with thalassemia or Jewish families with Tay-Sachs. But whilst this can't be attributed to anyone else's prejudice, it will lead to disparities and does demand a public policy response. In the case of sickle cell, the National Counselling Service and neonatal screening introduced by Labour government 15 years ago, essential. So we need a more sophisticated approach to the issue of racial disparity than simply assuming that they're just black and white and they arise only because of white prejudice. Without this approach, we'd also miss what is undoubtedly the greatest cause of ethnic disparity, economic disadvantage, and economic change. And I don't just mean poverty or unemployment. I mean, for example, the fact, as I said earlier on, Pakistani Muslims, people arrived to work in the textile industry. 20 years later, that industry is extinct, and with it, the communities that they lived in. Their children are born into poverty, and this is not about individual racial attitudes. It's a deep disparity caused by a history we can't ignore. And by the way, something similar can be said about largely white communities in coastal towns and former mining or shipbuilding communities. And that's what we mean when we talk about structural racism. So what does the government do? A government that aims to become anti-racist in its policy, fine, but it shouldn't limit its response to a series of separate marginal programs. When we think that racial disadvantage arises from causes far deeper than white prejudice, we become determined to adopt policies which apply to everyone, but have a greater impact on those who are most disadvantaged. So, for example, in the United States, the policy that most led to change for African Americans in my lifetime was not the Voting Rights Act, nor desegregation of schools, nor targeted urban renewal, though they all made a difference. It was, in fact, the minimum wage, which is a universal policy that hugely disproportionately lifted up African Americans and accounted for over a quarter of the rise in Black household incomes between the 1960s and the 1980s. Now, that's the kind of thing we need to be thinking about. Thank you.
That's a great place to open it up for questions, because we've only got just over 15 minutes, and I want to focus on practical ways forward, as Trevor called it, the public policy response. If you have questions, please do pop them in the Q&A. But we've had a couple of observations made in the chat around education being, as Kunle was setting out, actually where we've seen lots and lots of gains for a range of different groups, some ethnic minority groups outperforming their white counterparts. And yet it is often the lack of work experience or the lack of connections and social capital, something I know Julia has been working on, that hold people back. So on the panel, do you have thoughts about the practical changes that we can make, whether they are targeted at individual groups or targeted at people without social capital in general, to help convert educational success into workplace success?
Well, very briefly, Polly, I've already talked too much, but very briefly, it's right there in the report. The single most important recommendation, I think Kunle may agree with me on this, was the extended school day. Nobody has talked about it.
I did a programme for BBC Radio 4 on networks, and I went to a school built under shiny new Labour money on the edges of Ipswich. And I went back in over 3 months to talk to a cohort of mixed race children about networks and social mobility. And between the first and the second visit, the school had performed disastrously in their exams. And I asked a teacher off the record to say why they thought that was, given that, you know, the building was practically full of gold taps and winning awards in Europe for being a marvelous place. And it came down to an isolationist myopia where the community was undiverse. It was drawn entirely from housing estates locally. It was so isolated that one of the parents had responded to a permission slip for a trip to local Mersey Island with the reply, "My child can't go, they don't have a passport." And so again, this brings me back to this point that lack of diversity in some respects affects absolutely everybody of class as well as ethnic background. And that's what we need to address. And one specific way around that, I believe, is that you have to match everybody in the BBC, everybody in Parliament, everybody in the FTSE, in the C-suite, and say, and Trevor and I have talked about this, and this is a project we sort of haven't quite got off the ground, but I'm sure we will, which is to say there's a cohort of people that belong to these networks that are available to come into the room, virtually or otherwise, in order to learn, to participate, to belong early. You know, coming from a position of marginalization is not going to help get us to what I believe needs to be the mantra, which is the center of the room.
Kunle or Shaquille?
Yeah. I mean, Trevor's touched on one solution, which is the extension of the school day. When I think back to my own youth experience, actually, I went to school. I also went to an after-school club till 6 o'clock every day for years. And that was part of my development in terms of organized play and unorganized play, in terms of developing skills outside of academia, but more importantly, the exchanging of understanding between people of a range of different cultural backgrounds, from West Indian Creoles to German Polacks to West Africans, none of which actually created problems for me in terms of social discourse, and certainly enriched my life in terms of understanding the notions of universality and the character of individuals. But I would add to that also the question of apprenticeships. We've just seen from the COVID experience the impact of Kickstart, for example, an emergency program, but yet one which could have actually been introduced in non-COVID conditions, which is getting a very popular response and having tremendous resonance with employers. But also the question of, I think somebody put in the chat about contacts, young people not having contacts with industry and institutions. I think that's something we also have to look at in terms of how do we create that. We do it for graduates, undergraduates, but we don't do it on a regular kind of process as we used to in terms of the career service, which pretty much, if we're honest, has now collapsed in most areas. So there's a gap there that definitely needs to be filled.
Shaquille, any thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Polly. So I suppose it comes down to two things. So I think there's a challenge even with the education not getting the opportunities. But I'll share with you some thoughts on what some organizations have done, because I often hear when organizations are recruiting, they don't have representation on panels, and that sends a very clear message. If you're a diverse candidate sitting in front of a very stale looking panel, you walk away with a very clear message that this is not an organization where I can thrive, I can succeed. And the question is, well, if we don't have the diversity already internally, well, what choice do we have? And I think, organizations, as somebody has put in the chat, it's not enough that young people need to, need to be able to, employees need to be able to go out to young people, but young people need to be able to see themselves being able to succeed in those organizations. And what organizations have tended to do is they go to the employee resource groups and ask them to, to sit on these panels, or they find somebody, a person of, of an ethnic background and have them added to the panel. And I think there's so much more we can do to connect work with society, where, and one of the recommendations that I've often given is that go out to the community groups. Don't don't go to the people already, go to the people already in your organization, but understand that they're the ones who are suffering from, being excluded already. And you're asking them to fix the problem that they're suffering from. Go wider. Go to where, talent exists everywhere. Go wider. Don't wait for talent to come through your door. Go to where, the talent is. Go to community groups. If you want more representation, connect with find out who's in your community. Whatever that, that minority grouping might be, get representation onto your panels. Get the panel thinking differently. Because and give them equal, decision-making powers. Train them on, if they don't have to recruit, train them. Start doing things differently, because again, mentoring programs are great, training programs are great, but unless there's a visible difference that takes place in an organization, it just feels like window dressing from the outside looking in.
Can I just give a little shout out though to the idea that we don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel. What we have to do is minimize complexity and embrace a certain amount of simplicity and streamlining. One of the things that I thought was done very well in this report is that it was pretty articulate with all the caveats that all the critics and some of the speakers here today have given about its structure and its timing and its remit and its scope. But the reality is it began to do some serious framing. And one of the things that I think we suffer from is that everyone's sort of doing their own thing. Whereas what matters is an overriding narrative, an overriding context, and then some very specific coordinating actions. This was also something that came up in the conversation yesterday about the Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, which is somebody was on the BBC, I'm afraid I don't know who it was, somebody speaking for the government, but speaking sense, who said in the end, there aren't that many rules one has to have about what constitutes racism and unfairness. Let's just put them out there, let's make them transparent, and let's not do them. So in the same way, inclusion from different networks has got to run through a system, a process. That's what leadership is for. That's what management is for. And this comes back to my point that the dysfunction at the heart of the working world, whether it's in government, in the non-profit sector or the corporate sector, is really what we should be also framing our change agenda through.
Thank you. We only got 6 minutes left. So speaking to complexity, which Julia's just raised, there's another point in the chat around the complexity of careers advice. And I certainly remember at my school, we used to laugh about the careers advisor behind her back. I think we called her Frillneck, but nobody took her seriously. Is that something, is it fixed? Is it fixable? I'm really interested in the panel's thoughts. And then one other thought is a campaign that I have a lot of sympathy for, is this campaign that all job adverts should show the salary, because often the wage gap will arise because some kinds of people are more able to push for or argue for a particular salary, and it reinforces elite salary differential even when you change job. But we have esteemed and expert HR professionals here who I'd love to know if you think that I'm wrong, or if we should in fact just always show the salary on all job ads. Any thoughts on either of those before we close? Trevor, you at Green Park advertises a lot of jobs. Do you show the salary? Am I wrong?
No, we don't. On career advice, I've never had any, so I have absolutely no capacity to comment on that. On the job adverts, I understand why you're saying let's show the salary. I think the problem is that in reality, it doesn't quite work, particularly in some sectors where there are specialized skills and there is a market for them, for example, in tech. It just isn't going to happen, because basically what happens is the employer is going to pay what's necessary. I think what we need is something a bit closer to what Julie's just been saying, which is some simple principles by which people can test themselves when they're making decisions. Having been, somebody who frankly devised a lot of the bureaucracy around, for example, the public sector duty, I am largely responsible, I think, for quite a lot of the practices that HR professionals have to follow these days about, what questions can you ask and whatnot, and so on and so forth. I don't have any regrets about doing that, but I do think that we have to, I think we should have had a review of the Equality Act this year, because I think some aspects of practice have now been bureaucratized to such an extent that actually what's happening is that the people who are least advantaged are the people who are being shut out once again, not because people don't like them, but because they can't navigate the extraordinary processes, for example, of recruitment or promotion or progression. And I personally, I think in this territory, I think we need more simplicity, more transparency. I agree with that, but I'm not sure that, I'm pretty sure, to be honest, that I wouldn't be looking to impose more common rules.
Shaquille, you're nodding.
Well, I was going to say, I was looking at the time, wondering how much time we've got left. I'll keep this very brief. So I think the salary question is a great question. The Equal Pay Act came out in 1970. We had the gender pay gap come out a few years ago. We've got hopefully the ethnicity pay gap on the horizon. I think talking about salaries openly, having transparency, brings things out into the open. It doesn't leave anywhere for anyone to hide how people are being treated and when fairness exists. I think one of the great things about the gender pay gap, it forced organizations to actually publicly say where they are currently, what they do intend to do differently, and then to be report on that again a year later. Now, some of that was, very clear. Some organizations, gave lip service, but it forced the conversation. And again, coming back to how we started today's session, it is about forcing those uncomfortable conversations and getting people to talk and actually exposing where there is unfairness and equity and seeing what we can do differently. And if that can come out of, having salaries advertised, great. Career advice, just pick up on that. As I said, my career options are very limited: lawyer, engineer, accountant, or doctor, to become credible and respected in your community. That was it. And because I was born, with this color, that was why that message was given, as opposed to what could help you be the best version of you. And I think that's the question that all career advisors should be asking all young people. How can we help you be the best version of you? And that's ultimately the end point of any good HR professional.
Can I just ask about career advice? When was the last time as an industry career advice was looked at, held up to the light, even explored? Because certainly of the 5 children and stepchildren that I have raised, I don't think any of them have ever received career advice that is remotely meaningful or helpful or fit for purpose. And so my closing view is that we now need to not just reframe and reset what we think about race and diversity and inclusion in the workplace, but some of those very fundamental underpinning systems, and I include with the greatest of respect HR amongst them, and career advice. The whole shooting match, we need to rebuild it.
So we have less midlife crisis.
I think that the government recently launched some sort of app where you can get told to be a painter or a ballerina or something, which everyone mocked. Kunle, let me turn to you for the last words. What will you take away?
I think Trevor's point about the minimum wage is really, really important. Not just because of the way that it lifted people up, but it points to also what we've alluded to, which is the fact that you can have factors that are incidental to the discourse on race, which actually have a greater impact than people appreciate. And in the same way, you can reverse that relationship. And that is where the struggle, I think, in terms of ideas now rests, which is that we have factors that we can use to stimulate to make the kind of social corrections that we're looking for. And sometimes, unfortunately, we may be looking in the wrong places, and that's the problem. If we can eradicate that or come to, let's say, some sane agreement, then we will go far in making change.
I think that's a brilliant place to end, though I wish we didn't have to. Let's try looking in the right places for the answers. Thank you to everybody who has made a comment, listened along, participated, and thank you, of course, to all of our speakers. Please do stay in touch with Demos and with Julia's Workshift Commission, which will be running throughout the rest of the year. And thank you so much. Take care, everybody.